Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and today my guest is Yamini Aiyar, who is currently a visiting senior fellow at the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown University and the author of the recent book Lessons in State Capacity from Delhi's Schools. Her main research interests are contemporary politics, state capacity, welfare policy, and federalism. We talked about the challenges of education policy and welfare in India, the lack of agency experienced by school administrators and teachers, the role of local governments in education, Delhi's experiments with education reform, portable benefits and school vouchers, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Hi Yamini, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I can't believe we've not done this before.
Hi, Shruti. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be on the show. I've listened to so many of the podcasts, so it's a real privilege. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I mean, there's so many things that I want to speak with you about because you've been like this prolific columnist. You've written so much about federalism, about education, about state capacity. But I first want to start with your latest book, Lessons in State Capacity from Delhi's Schools. And this is such a well-written book. And I am sort of amazed that you made me feel so much empathy for a government servant and a government school teacher, which is not my natural inclination. And at the end of it, you really kind of flipped it around for me because we're always thinking we need more accountability from government servants. They don't do their job and things like that. And we never really consider that there is a trade-off between accountability and agency, at least the way the Indian state has set it up, right? This kind of top-down, normally accountability would come bottom-up. You'd be accountable to the people, which gives you agency from the people. But we've kind of flipped it on its head, right? So there's this accountability to the babus and the politicians at the top, but that means a complete loss of agency and an inability to actually function the way they're supposed to function with purpose. So, by the end of it, I was like, wow, we've flipped this on the head, and I never thought there's an accountability agency trade-off, but we have managed to create a bizarre artificial trade-off. That's another, government innovation in India. So can you start, for those unfamiliar with the Delhi school experiment, can you start us off with what that is, and then we can get into all of this?
Sure. So it's a well-known fact that public schools in India leave a lot to be desired. And over the last 20, 30 years, we have made some significant strides when it comes to the goal of universalization of education, particularly from the 2000s when the government of India launched the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which sort of was a culmination of a whole set of things that had happened in school education policy from the late 1980s, with a focus on achieving universalization, by which broadly it meant to ensure that all the inputs for schooling were in place and accessible to all citizens. So the building of the school building, hiring of teachers, and a massive campaign to expand school enrollment, such that by the mid to late 2000s, we had achieved the goal of near universal school enrollment. And more or less, of course, there are some how to reach places that where there were still gaps, but broadly, more or less, ensured that there was a school building within a 5 kilometer radius of every habitation. So anyone who wanted to go to school had access to school. And this governmental kind of expansion of the school system also coincided, and I use that word carefully because I don't think that it came from a bottom-up kind of social and political consensus. There was a set of things that were happening that led to the government taking universalization of education seriously and making these strides. And almost parallel to that, society too was kind of arriving at a point where the idea that education is central to social mobility and a potential better future for children, including crucially girl children, had been kind of reached. And so the two came together, which is why you see a huge expansion in enrollment in the public school system. And yes, it was amply evident to anybody that stepped within that walked through around the periphery of a public school in India, government school in India, that even though on paper it all looked like significant strides had been made, what happened inside the classroom left a lot to be desired. And I must add, this was not just a challenge of the public school system, it's more broad, it cuts across both public and private. And from the mid 2000s, the Asar survey led by the NGO Pratham, which really began to ask what happens inside the classroom and have has our policy structure become so caught up in chasing the achievement of inputs that we have completely disregarded the actual process of learning. So, Land Pritchett has that wonderful title of his book, Schooling Ain't Learning. Indian policy making had moved and made significant strides in the direction of schooling and had kind of almost, you could argue, assumed that schooling was learning. Whereas anyone who began to look and peer inside the school began to recognize that schooling ain't learning. There's a lot more that needs to happen in the classroom and that we need to understand. So Indian policy making led largely through a combination of Pratham and Asar surveys that were bringing this out into the public domain on a regular basis and kind of opened up a larger conversation with academics, civil society organizations, parents around the question of the quality of learning in schools, had begun to find its way into the discourse on school policy, on education policy. And every now and again, you saw these sparks of state governments. School education is a concurrent subject, but largely its implementation in the hands of state governments. I know we're going to talk about federalism in a bit, but state governments began different kinds of experiments. Yet, it never fully entered the political discourse. So when I said earlier that there was this kind of I said that there's a kind of two parallel things happening: government expanding to the goal of universalization, and parallelly, not in tune or in step, society is arriving at its own conclusions about the significance of school education as a means of social mobility. It really comes together in the political discourse on school education, where it rarely finds its place in the political dynamic or the terms of the political contract between citizens and state, which is not to say the broad welfare function of the state isn't embedded in the dynamics of electoral politics. So, social security, midday meals in the mid 2000s, the expansion of the welfare state around National Rural Employment Guarantee, the right to work, the right to food, all of that comes in and becomes part and parcel of the political social consensus. Yet education continues to remain at the periphery. And this has always been this great puzzle for many. How is it that a democracy, a vibrant democracy, in which the welfare function of the state plays an important role in electoral dynamics, has rarely seen education and health come into the front and center of the political discourse, and particularly around the electoral discourse? So, something that political parties deploy to seek political legitimacy and gain electoral gains from. So here we are now in 2015 in Delhi. Anyone who's familiar with Delhi is aware of the sort of emergence of the Aam Aadmi Party that kind of burst into the political landscape in 2012, starting with India Against Corruption, morphed into a political party, comes into power in 2015 in Delhi, and makes education or school education a really important piece of its offering, which in my reading wasn't really the central piece of what Aam Aadmi Party was about. They were talking about corruption largely in kind of public services, so ration and other aspects, contractors, and then big ticket corruption. What the social contract around education was never really part of the early discourse. Yet once they come into power, they make school reform a big part of the story. And they make school reform a big part of their story largely through the vision of the then Deputy Chief Minister and Education Minister Manish Sisodia, for whom I would argue this was a passion project. So here we are sitting in my home city where something really interesting is happening on schools, something that I had been working on for a very long time. And I could hear when driving on the radio and through advertisements that were plastered all over the city that the reform package that was being debated in the public domain wasn't just about how many teachers have we hired, how many school buildings have we made, how we are upgrading infrastructure, how we are painting the walls, all of which, of course, was part and parcel of this. But there was also conversation about what children are learning. suddenly the deputy chief minister is on the radio saying we did an assessment and we found that 70% of children in standard 6 can barely read a paragraph and comprehend it and articulate it, and yet the class 6 curriculum is going way ahead. Many of us who had been talking about the challenges of Indian education, school education, had been highlighting these issues for quite some time, and suddenly now it finds its way into the political discourse of a political party as they are beginning their governance trajectory in the state. And really, what we did in this book was to study this. We got the opportunity first, just as a documentation task, to see what was happening as an attempt is being made to reform the school system from the perspective of not just improving schooling inputs, but also bringing the pedagogical changes that may be necessary to improve learning outcomes inside the school. We got a chance to see what was being done, how it was being done, and how the translation of the ideas and vision actually unfolded inside the classroom through the teachers and the headmasters and all the other frontline officers tasked with the implementation. Broadly, many things were happening. I mentioned infrastructure. There was a significant attempt to strengthen the infrastructure of the school. There was an attempt to, at least for the early years of this reform, experiment in different ways, and there were some positives and some challenges with the experimentation, but experiment in different ways with trying to bring all students in classes 6, 7, and 8 as close to curriculum level expectations as possible by emphasizing foundational literacy, numeracy, and getting them kind of up to speed. There was also embedded in this an attempt to identify what they called non-readers. I mean, this is the sort of colloquial terms that were being used because they found that there were students in classes 6, 7, and 8 who were still not able to confidently read a paragraph and comprehend. There were also attempts at some reforms that were complex in class 9 and 10, but really the bulk of what we were studying was this. And to enable this, an effort was made to reorient the training, to create a cadre of what we call mentor teachers who are going to kind of be the diplomats of this reform effort to try and support and enable teachers inside the classrooms to adopt some of the reform ideas in their everyday pedagogy inside the classroom, and a set of basic baseline assessments to track improvements inside the school that were put in. So these were the key things that we focused on. There were other things that were happening, but this was the core of what was attempted to shift the learning trajectory inside schools in Delhi.
That's super helpful. And before I ask you to talk about the kinds of reforms and how you track them and the effectiveness, one of the things, that struck me when I was reading the book is India becomes a welfare state pretty late in the game, right? It's only like in the mid-90s. So first, it's after 1991 for a couple of reasons. We had this big push towards decentralization in local government, but we also have a big push through the market. And suddenly, through economic growth, the government has the revenues to be a welfare state for the first time, which it didn't before. And a planning state is already a welfare state, right? So you don't need to do welfare above the central 5-year plan in some sense. So it's only post-liberalization that the penny really drops. And what I realized is India has been giving welfare in a very upside down way, right? Like we've been doing fertilizer subsidies and LPG subsidies and, all sorts of widgets, sometimes direct cash benefits, all of those things. But those things are necessarily different from education and health, which are very iterative. And the same participants keep running into each other over and over and over again, right? So the possibilities in health and education are quite different than what you have in, say, an LPG subsidy. The possibilities of corruption are also quite different. So once we became a welfare state, the way I see that story play out is, most of the money used to leak out. So we needed some, smart way of tracking and accountability. And now, this was already the mid to late 90s. India is amazing at building software. We've leapfrogged into the digital age. So we will digitally track everything. Right now, through UPI is the final step of that. So we managed to remove all leakages. But education is not a leakage problem, right? Education is just fundamentally different. So one, can you walk us through how education is a different welfare service from everything else that the government tries to do? And some of the challenges that come from this kind of top-down accountability where the central or the state government bureaucrats at top are like constantly issuing notices and metrics and measures, and it's not going to give you quite the same result as tracking the number of LPG gas cylinders, if the number that left the warehouse are the number that reached the village.
Thanks. So let me just, before I get into the education story, just say two things on the sort of broader framing that you lay out. I recently read and reviewed Louise Dillon's book titled Making India Work, and it offers a really interesting kind of contribution to what we know about the Indian welfare state. And actually, it fills in a huge gap about what we don't know. And I always thought of myself as somebody who knew quite a bit about India's welfare state, only to realize I knew very little from reading her book, because there was a huge thing. There were a lot of things that happened that we simply didn't know about. So one of the really interesting things, Louise kind of describes India's welfare state as a precocious welfare state, and I was like, this is sounding very strange. But she goes back into the archive of history to discover that we brought in an employment ESI, the Employment State Insurance Act, in 1948 on the back of a set of things, including interregional competition between industrial workers, that eventually led to the nationalization, to a demand for nationalization of the economy. And the ESI was kind of the first step to that. From what I learned from Louise's work is that India actually was way ahead of its time and was one of the first countries that did so before becoming a full-fledged democracy. I think we were one of the first countries to be part and parcel of ILO discussions as well. And we put in an ESI before the United States. So all of this was news to me. We have had attempts at trying to build some kind of foundations of a welfare state that run deep into even a pre-independence history. But one of the things with the Indian welfare state is that while it created a set of laws and welfare protections for the formal economy, which we know is a very, very, very tiny sliver, and over time made it so rigid that it served the purposes of neither labor nor capital, there was a big gaping hole in the informal economy, which is where the bulk of India lives and works. And despite a lot of kind of calls to welfare,
or maybe because of it, because that's also endogenous to it, right? The informal sector is endogenous to the crazy amounts of welfare imposed on what is largely a very unskilled pool of labor.
But there was no, the whole question of how best to ensure the social and the social and economic rights of the informal workers, which in our constitution were placed firmly within the directive principles, left a big kind of gap. And while it always came up in electoral politics in different ways and forms, it never necessarily translated into a serious and significant attempt at building a welfare state. And health and education, of course, were part and parcel of that, which was left out of the package. And it really does only come to bear in the late 1990s after the first phase of liberalization. And I think here social movements played a very, very important role in bringing up and creating that mobilization pressure for the state to respond and build at least a broad kind of over time foundation of what would be some sets of universal rights and protections for all citizens. So it's a sort of long and checkered history, but you're absolutely right that it really only comes to bear post-liberalization and with the attempt at building this rights-based welfare state in the mid 2000s when the UPA came to power. However, of course, state governments were experimenting in different ways, and so much of what India has built up comes from the bottom up. But in all of this, corruption and accountability have always been at the heart of the challenge. And the challenges of corruption are very much part and parcel of the power asymmetries of the Indian state, particularly at the cutting edge, and the capacities of citizens to have sites where they are empowered to kind of raise accountability claims on the state. And I think the rights-based movement was interesting precisely because it kind of sought to address this challenge through a kind of citizen empowerment framework. But the structures of the state have never been effectively responsive to that. And I think in our impatience and frustration with this, the digitization kind of emerged as an alternative. And it emerged as an alternative that could in the best case scenario, bypass the layers of the state altogether. And in a worst case scenario where you can't bypass the state, you seek to find solutions that are aligned to the tools that you have. So the solution is how best can you perfect the panopticon to extract accountability out of the state, right? So if I can create a command and control center that is going to see that the teacher is showing up in school on time, I think that the teacher is accountable. Yeah.
There's a video timestamping. The panopticon example is not, I mean, you're not really exaggerating when you call it a panopticon.
No, no. I mean, literally, there are command and control centers. I kid you not that I'm doing this, right?
Yeah,
And
where teachers
somehow,
have to take a picture with the students and a textbook, time stamped, and the biometric entry into classrooms. Oh, good
yeah,
God.
yeah. And I mean, and that kind of brings me to the education question, right? I mean, in some ways, I think education is a perfect site to ask some of these larger questions about the role and function of the state. Lant in his work, Akshay Mangala in his recent book, Making Bureaucracies or How Bureaucracy Works, both in kind of Akshay building on Lant's work, take a surgical view of the different tasks that the state actually performs and says, let's break these down and try and understand how to map these tasks, and at what level, what is the nature of that function, and therefore what is the nature of the solution that we may need to bring in to ensure that that function is actually fulfilled to the purpose of what it is. And broadly, the important thing that they point out is that functions that are transaction intensive, functions that require certain degrees of discretion, require agents on the ground to be empowered. You can't monitor, you can potentially monitor the delivery of cash into a bank account from sitting far away in your command and control center because you can see step by step how it's going through the layers of the system into the bank itself. You could potentially even see what day it's taken out, but you're unlikely to know who is taking it out. And you're certainly definitely not going to be able to track to what purpose it is being used. So, if the goal of the state is just a transfer of money, this works fine. If the goal of the state is to ensure that you're providing quality education, then you can go all the way to see that the money has been taken out. You could potentially, if you really want to try, track whether the individual is using that money to put their child into a private school in aligned to your goal. But there's no way you're going to be able to know what's actually going on. The nature of of that task itself is much more discretionary. It requires, for instance, the teacher to have a much more nuanced and understanding of what students know and what they don't. And it requires the teacher, therefore, if she has to achieve her goal of teaching to whatever kind of competency goal has been set, to reorient and reshape her teaching depending on how the child is. Indeed, if the child comes to school having not slept very well the night before, their concentration levels would be different. If the subject today is boring to the child because the child is more interested in some analytical concept and this one is requires you to just learn up your tables no matter what, then the way you teach has to change. So it's a much more complex, much more nuanced, much more embedded set of actions. And those embedded set of actions also need you to be very embedded in the context. So embedded and engaged with society. So interacting, deliberating, organizing around the particular local context in which you are, and the local power dynamics and power relations will also shape then how the individual acts. So if you're going to convert this transaction intensive discretionary task into something that has to be tracked and traced, because you can track and trace things easily and you apply the same method that you're applying to the transfer of cash into an account to holding the teacher accountable for learning, inevitably you're going to convert what is a fairly complex process into the easiest and most easily identified, verifiable set of outputs that you seek. So you will take a classroom and you'll say, okay, I want to ensure that the teacher is in the classroom for 45 minutes, completes the syllabus based on whatever prescribed syllabus has been given. And the measure by which I'm going to ensure that I can track learning is to see what the pass percentage inside the classroom is. Now, what does that do for the teacher? The teacher is going to sit in the classroom and say, my goal is to complete my syllabus. So whether the child at the back of the classroom is getting it or not my problem. I'm going to complete the syllabus because if I don't, I will not be doing my job. Secondly, because I'm going to be asked about the pass percentage, I'm going to focus on those children that I can see who are largely in the front of the classroom, metaphorically speaking, who are closer to whatever it is that the classroom requires us to, that the syllabus requires us to achieve. And I'm going to focus on them. And so, like in one teacher we were interviewing put it really nicely when she said, look, I know what level the children are in my class, but often I tell them, just rote learn this. We say in Hindi, ratta maro, just learn it up, memorize it, put it out, you will pass the exam, you will be happy, I will be happy, we can all get on with it. So we've basically converted the process of teaching and learning, which is a transaction intensive discretionary process, dynamic in its very localized context, into something that can be tracked and traceable. Because in the hierarchical culture of bureaucracy, all bureaucracies are hierarchical. The Indian bureaucracy kind of reifies its hierarchy to a fault, and so looks for tools to measure and hold its system accountable within that framework. And so it reduces everything to that and makes the entire purpose for which you are holding the system accountable reduced to the very narrow, specific, verifiable output goals that you can identify, to the extent that you're holding anything accountable at all, creating a system that looks like a perfectly functional system on the surface, but inside is completely broken and dysfunctional.
Yeah, so I think most people who are listening will not be surprised by this. I mean, you and I've been to really posh schools in Delhi, and even we had to do some version of this, rote learning at some point in our lives, right? So some of it is just the incentives, and some of it is what's happening inside a government school. But there were two additional things that I learned from your book, which truly surprised me. So I'll give you what was my version of a government school teacher. Right? It's typically this unionized government worker who kind of shows up in the class because they must show up in the class, right? They're not very sensitive to the needs of the students. They actually really teach sometimes they teach the same students in private tuitions after and do a really good job. But when they're inside the government school, they don't do very much, right? And so I just thought of these people as these, sort of, overpaid, entitled, government servants who don't do very much, which is, I guess, I'm not unusual in that. But what I didn't know is two things. One, I didn't realize how much other crap they are made to do. Right? So if the government wants to push Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, there will be Swachh Bharat Abhiyan sessions and days in that school, and there'll be some mandate and someone will show up to check. If it is yoga day, then, someone will show up to see if yoga is being done in the school, right? If it's midday meal or the midday meal has changed, whatever is the flavor of that month, they need to actually not just execute and incorporate it in the curriculum, they need to actually implement it, right? So teachers are responsible now for yoga and midday meals and nonsense like that. So that was one part that genuinely surprised me. The second part that genuinely surprised me was how you managed to track that these folks, teachers and administration, they don't feel like they have much agency. They feel completely powerless in the system. And this was the shocker for me, right? Because we think of these petty bureaucrats as all powerful who can hold up our 10th standard school certificate if they wish and, can keep a kid out of school or can keep a student behind in class. Like, I never think of these people necessarily as powerless. So can you walk us through these two? And I know these two things are sort of interlinked. So can you just walk us through what this is, especially what you saw in schools before and after this reform was conducted, or during even?
Shruti, you're absolutely right about how we think about the frontline bureaucracy, basically as petty tyrants at their worst and mostly completely incompetent. So they're incompetent petty tyrants who have ensured that they deploy the powers of the state that they are so keen to acquire. And once they do, they get drunk on it and use that power to coerce, harass, and express the violence of the state upon the ordinary citizen. And the more marginalized you are, the poorer you are, gender, caste, all play into how the state kind of unleashes its violence on the citizen. And yet, once I started, over years in different ways and forms, being in the field, interacting with frontline officers, there was always this consistent narrative that one would hear from them about their own powerlessness, that we don't really know where and how we can fix this problem. So, just one example, in early days of the accountability initiative that I had, a research initiative that I had begun in the Center for Policy Research, this was 2008-9, a group of us, my colleague Avni, me, colleagues from Pratham, Satyam, and others, all got together to work in a set of villages in rural Madhya Pradesh, not very far away from Bhopal, with the idea the right to education had just been passed. There was a mandate within the right to education for parent teacher associations to play a much more active role in school level decision making. And it was commonly kind of recognized and understood that the big binding constraint to strengthening community participation in schools, parental participation in schools, was a lack of awareness and a kind of bureaucratic system with all these petty tyrants who didn't want to be held accountable by ordinary citizens. So, our kind of quote unquote mission was to mobilize the parent teacher associations, that we would run information campaigns, engage with parents whose children are going to the public school, to the government school, mobilize them, organize meetings. So that a process which was baked into the legislation of the right to education, that parents would develop a school development plan, could actually be actualized and then taken up through the system. With a semi-research hat on, this was for me a very nice paper that I could write and get peer-reviewed published. And so I had double incentive of actually documenting this experiment and getting it all right, both for its broader good to center to the developmental process, but also personally for my own gains of having a nice peer-reviewed paper published. But once we got in, reality hit, and even and in very simple ways, right? So you go through this process. In fact, parents are very keen to engage with the school, they get mobilized quickly, but the first question they ask is, where is the money? How much money is actually devolved to the school in ways that we can actually make a plan? And you discover along the way that, in fact, very little funding is actually allocated in a discretionary way to the school for reasons we just talked about, because we believe that accounting is accountability. So there's almost, in fact, we found one rule book that told the school that they need to spend 100 rupees on the sweeper for the school sitting in some village far, far away from. I mean, it just makes no sense whatsoever, but a tightly designed structure. And so parents then kind of are a bit disappointed, but they work something out. And we find halfway through the school year, no money has reached the bank account. So what was the plan? What was the point of having the plan? Nothing could be done. It's a very simple thing. There was a broken roof. They wanted to repair the roof so that during the monsoon, you could actually have classes. Teachers could show up, children could show up and sit inside the classroom. And you travel through the system, ask the cluster officer who was in charge of the school, ask the block officer who's closer to the cluster and the school, go all the way up to the district. No one had any information. And they would always shrug their shoulders and say, we are powerless, we don't know. So, in very real ways, one began to experience this powerlessness that we heard frontline officers talk about. And it all kind of came to a head when, once we were sitting and interviewing a district education officer in Bihar, in the course of our conversation, we said, well, all things considered, if you had the space and opportunity to really do something to improve the schooling in your learning in your area, what would you do? And a man who's kind of very much presenting himself as a government officer, drunk on power. He came 2 hours late for the meeting. 5 minions were carrying his bag. Somebody else was answering his phone. Lots of people were shouting. I mean, it's all there. It's not. And when I asked him why you became a government officer, he said many good things, and he also said, I have the power. And but when it came to talking about what he can do, he spoke of this in the third person. If the government wants, it can do a lot of things. अगर सरकार चाहती है तो बहुत कुछ कर सकती है. So you saw it. I began then to say, let's start taking this powerlessness claim a little more seriously. And in some early work that predates this book with our friend and colleague Shayana Bhattacharya,
Oh,
we
yeah.
kind of arrived at, we call this the post office paradox, that you often hear frontline officers talk about themselves as post officers, not in efficiency terms, I can move paper from place X to place Y, but very much in the sense of disempowered, I move paper from place A to Y, that is all I do. You push them, then they'll say a new form comes. We have to fill it up. We were once, you mentioned yoga. We were once sitting in Madhya Pradesh with a block education officer who also showed up in his Ray-Bans 2 hours late, looking very harassed with three phones because he had been told that morning that he has to call up all the schools to make sure that the Surya Namaskar had actually been conducted during the assembly session. This is just before the season in the schools, and there were many other things about that a block education officer could perhaps focus on. But his whole day was set aside because he had to make these phone calls, and it was literally "Ho gaya? Yes. Okay. Next phone call. Hua? Hanji. ठीक है." Then he would call up his boss and say, "Yes, sir, it's happened in 15 schools," who would probably have had to call up his boss, and so forth, right? So, and in this, their whole telling of what their job is no longer about the classroom, the students, the teaching. It is very much about this set of post office related paperwork forms now coming in the form of digitized MIS that they have to fill up to pass on upwards. And because it gets passed on into a hierarchical structure, into what Akshay Mangla so beautifully calls the legalistic norms, where the rules override the culture of what it means to get things done, that nobody asks to what end or how can I even use this information and data towards the goal of fulfilling the purpose of the whole education bureaucracy, which is to educate our children. And all this translates into the classroom in a really interesting, what I call in the book, this cognitive dissonance. Because through the course of these reforms and similar attempts at trying to kind of work with teachers to find different ways of interacting with children outside of the age grade matrix and the constraints of the curriculum to get them to kind of curriculum level expectations have been tried out in different parts of the country. Pratham has kind of pioneered this model called the teaching at the right level. And again, one would hear teachers, when you ask them, what are your constraints in the classroom? They would speak of their constraints in this framework of the post office state, of lacking agency, of constantly having to respond to demands from above, and of course, of broader society and the social distance and between students and teachers would come out in that context. But really, as sort of disempowered actors, never in the context of what they're actually teaching in the classroom. When the same teacher goes through experiments like teaching at the right level, pulled outside of the context of the classroom and starts interacting with the children on in a framework of what children know and how I can teach them to move them to the level that we expect them to be at a certain point in their learning trajectory, they actually teach differently. They're using different tools and methods and engaging. And every time, and in fact, that's kind of where this whole puzzle for me had started, because every time the same teacher, and we know even through some RCTs that this happens consistently, you take that experiment, you take the same teacher and the same children and take them back into the formal classroom setting, and you're back to business as usual. You don't see that kind of rapid change. And when I'm talking to teachers, they're telling me there's all these problems that are linked to their lack of agency and this post office paradox. They step outside of the classroom and they talk about what they learn. But when you try to close the circle back and say, so what is the real challenge? Why is it that children are coming to school and not learning? They will go back to the post office paradox and not to what they actually learned through the experience of focusing on teaching. So this cognitive dissonance is the real challenge, and it is what keeps a dysfunctional system entrenched in its dysfunctionality. And that's where reform, any effort that is trying to entrench a shift in the education system to move, we like to use these phrases now, they've become catchphrases, outputs to outcomes. Everyone wants to focus on that. We need data, real time data, we say, to track and monitor to ensure we get outcomes. We don't get outcomes because what gets measured gets done. We don't measure the right things. It's none of that, actually. It is about it's about taking this dysfunctional system and engaging with this cognitive dissonance in a way that by which you can break the post office paradox and bring the core purpose of the system back to what it's supposed to do, which is to focus on education. Then the measurement systems will start working.
So, one interesting thing, when I talk to my friends who are actually school teachers, and they're typically, school teachers in these posh private schools or like college teachers and things like that, they never talk about headaches coming from the principal and the administration and the prime minister, right? Their headaches are, oh my God, parents these days have gone bananas. I am on 15 WhatsApp groups. Every course I teach and every grade I teach has a WhatsApp group with all the parents of the kids, and they're driving me crazy, right? And usually the conversation's focused around, remember when we were kids, our parents barely knew what grade we're in and they never really spoke to our teachers except once a year and things like that. So To connect this to some of your other work, it seems to me that one huge part of the puzzle is they are accountable, they're just not accountable to the people they're supposed to be serving. And so, why is the solution not dramatic federalism, right? Why aren't we moving into a world where education is really provided by local government? Now, once upon a time, I realized that villages were like supposed to be these dens of parochialism and things like that. They never really had any funding. Now we're in a different world where for 30 years we've had Panchayati Raj and urban local bodies. Now slowly there's some devolution of funds going on, though not as fast as one would like. But these institutions are increasingly accountable. So why aren't we converting our frontline bureaucrats to truly be frontline bureaucrats as opposed to the branch extension of the top dog bureaucrat?
That's a lovely way of bringing federalism into this conversation. Thanks, Shruti. Two things. I think one, in my book, I call it the classroom consensus, and I think you're absolutely right. In elite circles, we talk about it as a quote unquote helicopter parent, and I have this wonderful kind of a set of notes in our observation field notes from the days we were tracking schools in Delhi, of when we were sitting in the headmaster's office in the early days of the Delhi reform, and an effort had been made to kind of do a basic assessment of basic learning levels of students, and then kind of reorganize classrooms according to student learning levels. And a group of parents just barged into the headmaster's office. This was the day of the parent teacher meeting, and they were really angry and upset. And if the best ways on which you would like to see citizen-led accountability, right? Empowered parents walking into the headmaster's office, asking them questions, and the headmaster kind of being like, oops, and now I have to respond. And what they were saying was the following. They were saying, how can you take a test of my child without telling me in advance so that I can prepare the child for the test? It's a, so, there is the classroom consensus is anchored both in a societal understanding of education as being about examination, passing the examination. Heck, I do this too. We were talking just before we started recording, right, of me and my kids and how obsessed I get during the exams for them to just rote learn and get some good marks. Okay, like how can my child not be in the top 10 in the class, and my daughter's looking at me, rolling her eyes, age 13, and like, you're just nuts, mom, get out of here. But that is the broader kind of social context in which we have built out the education system. And the reason I'm highlighting this, even though my work looks much less in the education space at the kind of broader societal and parental elements of it, I do think it links back to the federalism question in two ways. In that, because the whole evolution of the education policy happened kind of outside of the political context, and society was moving in a different direction, finding any means that they could to educate their children. We haven't actually arrived at a collective, broad based political consensus about the nature and form of public education. And public education is meant to do many things, including kind of harness society in some ways, right? And it is ironic in that in our founding moment, in so many ways, the imagination was that the democratic norms and transition that society would have to go through would go through the tools of the state. And yet, school education was never really at the heart of that process. And so we, that to me, that's been one big gap that has to be bridged. And it links to the local government question, because also as part and parcel of the founding moment imagination of the state being the vehicle through which democratic norms and societal transition would be infused, the state necessarily had to be at a distance from the people. And so in that sense, the local government has never been the anchor of many things in education, including that are at the heart of the transfer, heart of the tools in most polities the state uses to build a social contract and transition society. And I think that bridge has always been quite central to the challenge of education in India. Linked to this, then, if you start looking at the evolution of school education policy, particularly when we take off in the direction of mass education in the early 1990s, which coincides, as you say, with the 73rd and 74th amendments that were passed in 92, the original kind of structure on which the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan actually is based came through a very important kind of ground level civil society mobilization. And embedded in that was the imagination that was framed in the 73rd and 74th Amendment of a very decentralized structure for delivering school education. And one of the things that we did through the course of researching this book is to really try and understand the history of school education policy. And the thing that really struck us again and again is as we are moving in the direction of mass education, the policy imagination is in fact trying to decentralize education. It is meant to go through the parent teacher associations, the school committees, and the panchayats into the government structure. But the consensus around that, both amongst the actors on the ground, so the frontline bureaucracy that is supposed to initiate this transition, and broadly society itself was never built. And I think the reason it was never built was this absence of politics in the whole process of building out our public school system. And so there's always been this huge gap. To the extent that panchayats came in, their deployment was instrumental. So there was broad thinking that teacher accountability can best be had through teacher hiring and firing at the local government level. There's nothing to, you and I will certainly not quibble with that understanding. But most state governments picked up this policy, this broad idea and vision, and converted it into an instrumental policy to address fiscal constraints. So, as we are kind of moving in the direction of mass education and hiring teachers at scale, teachers unions are powerful political lobbies. Teachers wages, government teachers wages are, at least 10x higher than than market wages. Lant and I have done this work in a paper that was published on the CGD website that kind of looks at this very closely, as have several others. And so state governments kind of adopted this panchayat shikshak route as a way of contractualizing the teaching profession. But it was done with the goal of managing the fiscal deficit and contractualize. And in the process of contractualizing the teacher cadre, it broke three things. It broke the professionalization of the cadre, that is really crucial. It created an internal dynamic and a power hierarchy between the permanent teachers who were getting paid significantly higher than the contractual teachers. And it failed to understand the social contract of government jobs, which in India's political economy is very closely linked to permanency and wages. And therefore, these contract teachers in many parts of the country unionized and went to court, and the entire teacher hiring process gets stalled, right? So it created the worst kind of outcome where now you have weird shortages, even though you have a very large number of teachers. So the allocation of teachers is completely irrational to schools. So a whole set of things are happening as a consequence of using panchayats instrumentally rather than considering local governments as being at the heart of the accountability system of governance, and recognizing that education is actually a deliberative process. It requires what Akshay says in his fabulous work of Himachal Pradesh, deliberative norms to be infused in how bureaucracy works. And that can best be achieved, in my understanding, through the infusion of these norms at the local government level.
Yeah, and there are a couple of additional weird things, right? So in India, we use the local government almost like this, branch post office, which is exactly what you've talked about in your work, where a letter will be delivered from above. So, a post office analogy is great for multiple reasons. So we have education, which is a state subject, but there is a huge central outlay for it. There are centrally sponsored schemes for education. There are state schemes for education. And both of them are actually deployed at the local government level. But no one wants to be a local government employee because that's less money and less status. So you'd prefer to be a state government employee, even though it is a mess, right? So all these teachers, they feel like they have no agency and accountability, but they would still rather be a state government or a central government employee. So that's one bizarre part. But the other tragedy I see in all of this is when I exit the big metropolitan areas and, going to UP and going to Bihar, people really value education. And that's the reason I think we need to switch. So, when the framers of the Constitution were sitting together and deliberating, their baseline assumption was that there isn't a demand for education bottom up. There isn't a demand for equality. There isn't a demand for a lot of the things that a liberal democracy requires bottom up, which is why we are not going to focus on local government. Right? Now, I think this was a flawed assumption. Then it's flawed assumption now. But everything's changed now. I don't see the most regressive places in India, where you have Kap Panchayat saying all kinds of ridiculous, misogynist things. Even they care about girl child education, right? I mean, they don't want the girls to wear a mini skirt, but they want the girls to go to school because even they
Oh,
get
I mean,
it.
one of the most beautiful sites in India that started with Nitish Kumar's experiment with the cycles back in the day
Oh,
is that
yeah.
everywhere you go now, there are
There are girls
girls
on
in school
cycles.
uniforms with their hair in ribbons, riding their cycles, going somewhere. I mean, and that tells you a lot about the phenomenon as you described. Everybody values education.
Yeah, so once upon a time, they may have thought, oh, if it's the village, panchayat that does the education system, Dalits may be left out, women may be left out, and so on. We don't have that problem anymore. We've come a very long way. So, what is stopping us from switching that up and saying, hey, local governments are best placed to decide what are the learning disadvantages of their students, what is the local language, do they want to focus on math, do they need 3 extra math tutors or an extra sweeper, like what is getting in the way of this imagination?
So there's many explanations, and many of your listeners will be familiar. Many of them include particularly the broader politics and the nature of power sharing and how that's played out. But there's something that I learned that I think was different through the years of studying school systems and kind of trying to ask and answer this question, because it was a puzzle for me too, which is so the puzzle for me began with the district education officer that I mentioned earlier, who would sort of talk about the Sarkar wistfully when it came to what it can do to improve education as something that was far away, but embodied all the power of the Sarkar in his behavior with everybody, including us. As you know, me and my colleague was sitting there, and he kind of buzzes his thing, he presses his buzzer, and tells his chaprasi, his peon who walks in, tell everybody to be quiet because the Delhi madams have come. Like he wanted to show that I am an important person and these two madams from Delhi have come. And he spoke to us in, as most government officers will, very cognizant and conscious of the power that he commands by virtue of being a government officer. Yet the Sarkar, when it comes to doing things, is something so far away. And, that kind of raised for me this important question of what is it when we talk about agency and empowerment of a system that is caught in a set of hierarchical norms and an organizational culture that has beaten out its own agency from it. How does empowerment actually work? And we did, in various different ways, try to ask headmasters, frontline officers, panchayats, if you had a untied pool of money for the development of your village, what would you do with it? And they're all kind of scratching their heads. You don't get a good answer. I remember in some early conversations with Manish Shishodia when they had begun the experiment, two things stood out. One was that they created a kind of untied pool of, I forget exactly how much money it was, 5 or 15 lakhs. There's a huge difference between 5 or 15, but it was a substantive amount of money for infrastructure in their schools. And he was puzzled as to why it wasn't being used. Or in meetings that he would have with headmasters, where he would say, look, I'm the education minister. I'm here genuinely wanting to do something. Tell me what you want, and I will make it happen. And there's complete silence in the room. And one way of responding to this is just to dismiss it by saying, look, this is a system that just is incapable of doing. And so in our frustration, we will say, I'm here sitting in the secretariat. I know the 5 things that need to be done. I'm just going to push them all down below, which is basically what happens. But if you start interrogating it a little bit more, something new dawned on me. It is about the culture of the system. If the system has been designed to organize itself and build its own organizational ethos such that it defines its sense of performance by virtue of being responsive to sets of orders, it finds it very hard when you kind of, with a butcher's knife, kind of say, okay, I'm going to cut through the tyranny of the hierarchy and hand over power to you. Now go do. It just doesn't know what to do. It gets stymied. And that often creates a vicious cycle. Another example of this in a different sector, National Rural Health Mission, which was launched in 2006 with great fervor, says we want to do local governance led health systems building. And so we will create these pools of untied money that at the district and the panchayat level could be used for local level planning to improve health systems for anything. There was complete flexibility. They were called untied pools of money. And when we used to track these funds, we would find them completely unspent, many explanations. But one core part of that explanation was the fact that the system just didn't know how to react. Now, we often consider this to be a capacity constraint. Let's do training on how to implement things so that people can start making plans. But to me, it wasn't even it isn't a capacity constraint. It is the capability element of state capacity that was missing, which is an organization that is so embedded in a particular ethos of functioning in a certain way, being asked without changing the rest of the system in any substantive way to do something that it simply is not designed to do, then finds itself completely unable to do it, creating the justification and legitimacy for further centralizing powers. And I think that's what there is politics. There's power sharing, and the politics that comes out of power sharing, and the lack of willingness of the system to really decentralize and devolve. But to me, there's also this bit that we don't talk about enough. And that's why the need to kind of reorient our discourse on state capacity away from more training, more MIS, more panopticon to kind of, beat down the discipline and try and get things done, to start saying you cannot infuse agency overnight. In fact, when reviewing my book, Rajesh Veera Raghavan used a very nice term, which I was kicking myself saying, I wish I had thought of that. He called it the tyranny of the flexible circular. Because in the early days of the Delhi reform, again, a similar attempt was made to try and give flexibility to all the actors. And, when we would walk into schools, the system that is used to functioning based on whatever circular order it receives in the morning of is puzzling over. It says and or. So what is it? Is it and or is it or? Because we don't want to be hauled up for doing something that was meant to be and, but we took it as or. I mean, and really, what the language of the circular was trying to do was to say you can decide, because this whole reform is about empowering the teacher, and the teacher is going like, this is making no sense to me. So you can't do it that way. You have to kind of gently, carefully, and slowly nurture agency and change, from which I think the genuine demand for decentralization will come from the bottom up. And let me close by saying this. I think the 73rd, 74th Amendment were, in some senses, a top down effort at creating decentralization, right? It happens in parliament, and then it says that states should or could or may. It doesn't demand that states do it because local governments is a state subject. It says it may do it, right? That was one of the tricky things of the language of the 73rd and 74th Amendment, and states do different things. I have often puzzled about the following. You have written so much about this. If the government of India were to say today, I am not going to set up the Central Finance Commission, don't you think even BJP states will be out on the streets demanding and commanding that the fundamental constitutional right that you have as a state of having a constitutional body determined on the basis of a formulae, which we can fight over, but a formulae, how taxes would be devolved between and shared between center and state, were not to be put in place, the whole system would break down. Yet, when it comes to local governments, most states have stopped setting up state finance commissions.
And the ones that have it are disastrous.
Totally disastrous. And even though we have these very hotly contested local government elections, local governments are not on the streets fighting their state governments for not setting up state finance commissions or not fulfilling the recommendations of the state finance commissions, right? Because I think this exposure of the possibilities of what local governance can actually do, and building the terms of the social contract between citizens and the state, as local governments are expanding the surface area of the state and creating sites for this everyday engagement, happens through the top rather than emerges carefully, slowly, and in a nurtured fashion from the bottom up. So where you get civil society mobilizing, engaging, consistently doing things outside of the training classroom, you see occasional sites of change. but that's small and in small quarters. Ultimately, this is going to be a political battle that can only be achieved when the demand comes from the sites itself, which have been consistently disempowered. And I think that's kind of where we need to move the conversation.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I wouldn't even use the word disempowered. I think they weren't empowered in the first place.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
to
Yeah,
me,
yeah, yeah. You're right.
yeah, so to me, the difference, I get this from the great Richard Wagner, who taught me public finance and federalism and pretty much most of what I know. He always made a distinction between federalism and decentralization. He said, if you say decentralization, it means there is a higher node of power and they are giving up their power and authority to a lower level. Federalism means there are multiple nodes of power that can't be taken away or given, right? And to that extent, you're absolutely right. India is not truly federal because we are not fiscally federal. And all of it is pointless. It becomes a pointless decentralization exercise where people will decentralize responsibility and accountability, but they won't decentralize the funds. So eventually, we just need to do this bottom up. You're right. I mean, local governments and Panchayati Raj governments should be out with pitchforks saying, we demand 5% of all GST to be LGST or something like that, right? Like, why are we not saying that all consumption taxes are local? You consume locally, right? So why aren't we just moving towards something like that, even within a centralized system?
Yeah.
I have no idea. I mean, forget the devolution and passing the state legislatures passing law to say you can raise property taxes and collect stamp duty or user fees or something. So something's got to give. But why I find this so tragic is India has scale. Even the smallest villages can actually have a fully functional school, which is not true in Europe and the United States and vast parts of Africa. They're very unevenly distributed, right? The cities have lots of people and have scale, and the villages don't. And India has just an enormous amount of scale. You could have multiple schools in every village, and it would still break even in some sense. So the fact that we just don't do this just breaks my heart.
But there are interesting tensions, and I honestly don't quite know how to sensibly think about this. But let me throw it out there, right? Like, so let's stay with education for a minute. At one level, you could argue potentially, and also let's take the local government out of the equation for a minute and just talk about center states, because the local government story adds a whole other dynamic here. But if you look at education policy in India, at one level, you could argue that it is genuinely federal in that much of the innovation, which eventually becomes national policy, comes from innovation at the state government. And if you step outside of education, whether it's health, whether it's rural employment, which much of what the government has done at a national scale has been experimented subnationally and then made its way all the way up to the state. And if you look at many of these early experiments that shaped national policy, some of it was through a fair, in some cases, like the midday meals, it came through politics. But in many other cases, it was actually organized civil society, sometimes elite-led civil society, forging alliances with bureaucrats to kind of experiment and try different things out, and then slowly build this up into a national conversation, which eventually makes its way into national policy. And in some ways, I think that that's a genuinely federal achievement. That's a genuine federal achievement. Yet, when it gets to becoming national policy, the tools of national policy are so deeply centralizing that the very idea that comes from the ground becomes a centralized choke on any kind of innovation at the state level. I mean, one silly and simple example. Now I'm talking somewhere between 2010 2015 when I was doing a lot of field work in Bihar. I was chatting with the school teacher and the head of the SHG who was making the midday meal. And her big grouse was that the district gives you the menu. The menu was coming from the state. The state was preparing the menu because some orders had come from the national government or some
Of
such.
course.
And the menu required you to prepare certain types of vegetables on certain days. Some vegetables on certain days were easily available in the local heart. Other vegetables were not available on those days in the local heart. And it's a village in rural Bihar. So there's highly unlikely probability that there's a fridge in the school kitchen. And so she had this complete confusion, and she would mostly do her own thing. But there were a couple of cases of poison, of bad food and poisonously cooked food, etc., food poisoning in many parts, and I think some parts of Bihar too, which had kind of put the whole system on alert. So for that period there were inspections happening, and so she was like, well, I'm supposed to ensure that I give good quality fresh food so that there's no food poisoning. But on the other hand, I'm supposed to make lauki on a day that there's no lauki available here. And I can't go all the way to the district market in the morning and come back in time to cook it. And so it's just like this whole something that was meant to be so genuinely decentralized becomes this centralized throttle around the neck of hangs like a noose on the neck of the school of the entire system. So there is this tension, right? As I try to unpack this puzzle, one part of it also is that as you see post liberalization, there is also inherent centralization at the state level too in how states are operating, right? So the chief minister's office becomes the kind of power center, and everything else has to buzz around it. And so, across the system, something about how our politics has evolved and the dynamics of bureaucracy have evolved, that it has created this culture where even genuinely federalizing moments in our history have often become victims of centralization. Almost like the minute you get too successful, centralization becomes the means by which your success will are getting unraveled. And how to handle this tension in India is something that we need to think a lot harder about, because after all, isn't it a genuinely good thing that an experiment in Tamil Nadu became national policy? And there is broad-based consensus
Yes
around this.
and no, I would love if an experiment in Tamil Nadu became policy in Bihar because the Biharis went to Tamil Nadu, came back and said, hey, that's a great experiment. But the experiment in Tamil Nadu
But you
become
need something to bridge it, no? In this, that's the role of the government of India.
so that I think is the problem, because these are schools that don't have a fridge. So now you can't implement a midday meal scheme quite the same way, right? You can't do eggs quite the same way you do in Tamil Nadu in like parts of Uttar Pradesh. So I think, I know what you mean by there's a tension there, but to me, all of it points towards we need to step away from this crazy kind of centralization. And that's the Gordian knot. Like, how do we
Yeah,
do that? Because again, you're right, the politics has to enable that. Like, bureaucrats and civil society and experts writing papers is not going to make anyone give up their power and budgets,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So now Delhi is super interesting for a couple of reasons. Normally, what you describe, the deputy chief minister or the education minister just sort of rolling up their sleeves and getting involved, it can't happen at the state level because they can't travel through the states. There are too many schools. Now, Delhi is fairly compact. It's a very large city with lots of people, but it's still a city, right? So they're
Mhm.
kind of operating almost like a mayoral function as opposed to education ministers in a large state. So question one is, what were the reforms they tried in Delhi that you document, and could this have been possible anywhere other than Delhi? As you try to generalize this outside of Delhi, can it be done?
So, yes and yes, because the broad principles of what was attempted and the broad principles of what we learned of what actually eventually kind of starts moving the system. So, let me preface my remarks by saying the following. What we were trying to do in Delhi was purposefully not an evaluation of the reform, because we wanted to document the process through which an idea converts into action on the ground, where political will, at least for the time that we were in those schools, was intact. Because usually, very often, these studies will tell you that there was no political will or the political will changes. Here we get a fairly substantive period of 5 to 7 years where political will is firmly in place and there's space. The government has eked out space to do whatever it wants to do. And so we said, it's here is where the rubber hits the road, and I want to understand how the rubber is hitting the road. So I'm not looking to see whether 5 years of intervention is necessarily improving the quality of schools and taking them from A to B. I'm trying to understand how the change unfolds and what it does to the school. And over time, and there's lots of chaos and that unfolds, and there are many challenges. There's some good ideas, there's some not so good ideas, as is the real world field of reform, right? Like you'll always get
Yeah.
this mixture of many things going on. But to me, over time, what I saw was not a perfect and beautiful process that leads to the best outcome, but a slow, very, very slow, yet substantive, very, very small, yet very, very significant change, which I best document through stuff from conversations between teachers. So teachers are still complaining about everything on under the sun. They still feel like they're being beaten down by a system. They have no agency. This whole reform is like one more headache. They don't fully understand what is being asked of them. They are being told that they have to come to meetings to interact and engage in a way that is on paper participatory, but the hierarchy always means that that doesn't quite work like that. The best form of democracy in some ways is democracy where everybody thinks that, where the leader is thinking that I'm talking to everybody and bringing them on board, but basically I want everybody to do what I'm saying. So, a version of that is all unfolding over here as well. Resistance, distortion, pushback, everything is going on. But because it has happened over time consistently, and in the process of experimentation, one thing stayed steady, which is we all have to get with the program of saying we need to start asking ourselves what's actually happening in the classroom. So, through all the craziness and the mess, suddenly teachers are talking about their students within the frameworks of examinations, no doubt, and within the framework of rote learning and everything else. But they're talking about their students and what their students know and don't know. And then suddenly we hit COVID. The whole school system closes down for 2 years. And when schools reopen, there's a kind of moment where all of this comes together. It comes together because COVID means that, there's nobody to blame for the fact that children have had certain amounts of learning loss. And teachers are then able to deploy all the things that they heard, they learned, they engaged with into this collective task of saying we need to bridge the learning loss. And we did one short survey right after schools opened post COVID. So 2022, late 2022, we started talking to teachers and we got a sense that something's happening here. And in early 23, we did the survey. And really, teachers were talking about the last child in the classroom in a much more nuanced way than they had ever done before. And to me, that is what can be learned and deployed at scale, which is no reform is going to give you a magic bullet immediately. It is a slow and long term process. So you have to be patient. Sounds trite, but it's essential. And in the process of being patient, going back to what I was talking about earlier, when you try and kind of rip the band-aid off and say, I'm giving the local government agency do something, it doesn't know what to do with it, then we get confused and start doing capacity, and then we create new rules to tell them what to do, and we're back to square one. What we need to do is to, what I call in the book, kind of identify the interstitial spaces within the system and try and nurture them so you're exposing the system to sites of possibility. In Delhi, one of the things that stayed consistent over time was the presence of the mentor teacher who was consistently, they did a lot of administration. They were often challenged in many other ways. They sometimes the power elements of bureaucracy also found its place in how the better teachers were behaving with other teachers. But they were constantly repeating the mantra of learning and foundational literacy and numeracy to teachers in conversations. And the second thing that stayed consistent was that they kept doing camps and missions, reading camps, foundational literacy, numeracy camps, what became eventually something called Mission Bunyad, over like 3, 4, 5 years. And so the teacher was taken out of the context of the classroom, exposed to this. She went back. She still finds the classroom very constraining. She'll still complain about the exams and the excessive syllabus and all else that is the sort of mess that we have created in our education system and in the classroom. Yet, because she is kind of consistently, this interstitial space has been identified and nurtured, she's kind of going back into the classroom and saying, okay, maybe I have to think about the fourth row, not just the third row. Maybe that kid is behind, not because that kid is naughty, but because that kid needs a little bit of remedial on English. And so the dynamic starts changing. It's very subtle, it's very small. It is not going to give you the fancy number
Yeah.
of evaluation that you're looking for, but that you see change. And I think that is something that is possible to do at scale. And we are seeing kind of in different states in India examples of this. So when you clearly articulate the goal, which I think on foundational literacy and numeracy, the national education policy does a good job. It very clearly articulates foundational literacy and numeracy as the goal. It brings in Nipun Bharat and it kind of mobilizes the bureaucracy to say, okay, this is the goal. Let's all collectively start moving towards it. And you see small, very small, but some change towards a direction. Where I fear on NEP and the achievements that have been made is that, as usual, we are kind of now beginning to make the assessment the be end and end all.
Yeah.
That foundational literacy is the be end and end all. You achieve this, that is education, and you stop there. Of course not. It's a trajectory, it's a pathway, it's step one in a larger imagination of what
That was the
education is. And
floor,
yeah,
right?
all we are doing now is just saying let's concentrate on the floor and build it up. But if you only focus on the floor without thinking about everything else, you're not going to get anywhere. So that's where the gap is. But just to say, to answer your question, Delhi is an unusual and small place. It was perhaps momentary. The biggest test is going to be now with the change of government. Does the fact that, and even the critics, anyone who is even deeply critical of AAP and AAP's work, and in fact critical of the things that they try to do in schools, there'll always be debate, and that's healthy and good, will agree that this is one political party that, amongst many other things, also sought to gain political legitimacy by centering education. And for good, bad, it made education and it created action in schools. So does that action in schools and bringing through mega PTMs, etc., parents into the school system a little bit more, shift the social contract so that as citizens we ask what is basically a local government, and especially now with the NCT Act, Delhi is really just a local
Yeah, it's
government,
huge.
sadly. The power, does it create that bottom up pressure for some kind of continued focus on the goal of improving the quality of schooling in government schools to continue over time? I think that's the test. I don't have a positive feeling just yet, but it's early days, and we will see. But to the extent that there are learnings from Delhi that can be extended broadly to India as a whole, but beyond India, to how we think about the challenge of state capacity and how we debate the state, questions of accountability, questions of agency, and most importantly, bringing the whole norms and structures of the state into the conversation on state capacity. I think there's a lot that Delhi taught us, which is why I called it lessons in state capacity.
One thing I find lovely about Delhi is it became, I mean, you and I have grown up in Delhi, right? So we remember Delhi as this very bureaucratic central government, trees are lining paved roads kind of place, to it exploded in size and there was a lot of migration and there was influx of people from all different states and communities. And then suddenly there was no real compact between even the citizens, forget the citizens and the state, right? It became one of those places where people come to earn a living and it's quite transient. So one lovely thing that I think this experiment has at the very least achieved in Delhi is there is some consensus that schooling and schools are supposed to be places where you learn. Right? And I think that's a big deal. I mean, that sounds really obvious, but we've always treated schools as a place to credential. I mean, people finish their 10th so that they can get a pass certificate because, they didn't have a birth certificate or some other form of legibility. So schools have performed a selection function, a legibility function, a credentialing function. At least we can now agree that they are supposed to perform a learning function, and that's kind of the core of it. And the citizens are deeply part of it, and the administration is part of it. That, I think, is not a tiny thing, as you point out. That's a pretty big deal, all said and done. And hopefully the institutional memory carries them through.
Yeah, and some of the other experiments that they did, which I initially was quite skeptical about, I think the implementation was slightly half-baked. There's a lot more that needs to be done there. But, and everyday politics always takes over in different ways. But the happiness curriculum, the enterprise curriculum, there were sets of vocation. It was all the IB, and they identified schools of excellence in the second term and signed with the IB for a set of schools to do the IB briefly. There were many strengths and weaknesses to all of this. And one of the weaknesses was that too many things were being thrown at it. Every new idea was being, but whatever all that may have been, I think the fundamental core spirit that we can take to any part of India and any kind of politics, political party could adopt, which is the idea that you also want to show that government schools can offer to parents what private schools offer. So elite Delhi is all moving away from CBSE, ICSE to IB if you can afford it. Should a child that goes to a public school not have that opportunity? And if they don't, if not, then should we have a social conversation about why IB is probably not the best thing for students in the Indian ecosystem? I mean, there's so I mean, it may not be. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out as how you can generate a societal conversation, and that is where I think the public discourse that is largely led by elites needs to also adopt and adapt to bringing these issues into conversation, because after all, how will we arrive at these conclusions if it stays within domains of rarefied policy conversations or what educationists talk about behind closed doors? We need to kind of bring this discourse out. But unfortunately, there are also many real challenges with the particular contemporary political moment in India, where everyone is preoccupied dealing with that. And some of these very fundamental parts of what frame the terms of the social contract and actually frame the nature and form of democracy are getting left out. I wonder if the Indian state actually delivered on these core rights to citizens, that the urge to occasionally experiment with more authoritarian possibilities may not occur. Because remember, there's always that underlying thing of, well, the trains can run on time.
Before I let you go, I want to make one more connection with some of your other work. You've written, I don't even know for how long at this point, about portability of benefits, right? And how a lot of the federalism and migration and social protection, which are all deeply intertwined in India, suffer because we didn't have portability. And the poorest among us were actually leaving their villages to go find seasonal employment in cities where they had no safety net. And thanks in part to some of your work, we've had some introduction of portable benefits like food rations and things like that, right? Why is portability not a good experiment when it comes to schooling? This can, of course, be done through vouchers, which is, fairly straightforward. This is an old idea. It's there in the developed world. It's there in the developing world. Give students and families the money, which can only be used at a school, and they go to whichever school they want. A different kind of portability is, there are different buckets that are of budgets that are given to the local government, and they can port within those budgets, right? But they have to be accountable to the people. So are you going to spend the money on extra tutors for math, or are you going to spend it on textbook, or are you going to spend it on making sure the roof doesn't leak? So, there's an element of which vendor you use and who's empaneled and that kind of portability. So why is that not a good idea? Like, why wouldn't you bring your work from there into schooling?
Well, I mean, in a sense, I do, because any conversation about genuine local government participation in the school system essentially requires greater agency for the local government to determine how best to allocate funds in ways that make more sense at the local government level. But of course, it has to be a little bit more nuanced than that, right? And I think, again, going back to kind of Lance work and of looking at the different types of tasks that come together to make education. There are sets of standards and norms that have to be created, which do, in order for a system to be genuinely portable, everyone has to be able to align towards that basic set of standards and norms. That is, in some senses, an expert-oriented national function that has a societal that we arrive at through a deliberative societal conversation, but essentially the role of the expert is to convert that societal consensus into a set of standards and norms that need to be fulfilled across the board. And then there is this set of actions that need to come together for the actual act of schooling to unfold, where degrees of discretion are required, such that a school could say, I am deploying a bunch of first generation students who have XYZ need. And so I would like to use my funds in certain ways. Tribal communities, migrant communities, everybody's education needs will be different within that larger framework of standards and norms. So it is, to me, a challenge of decentralization or deepening federalism, to draw on the very important caveat that you gave to the use of the term decentralization. But precisely that if we are genuinely to move towards greater federalism, the idea is not to say that the school in Jangpura can teach the way it wants to, and the school in Burari should teach in a different way. It is to say that there's a broad set of standards that we societally agree upon that are acceptable of basic sets of competencies and learning trajectories that we expect all students to achieve. And that's why you have boards, right? Like the boards kind of set that standard, and how you teach has to have degrees of flexibility, which is very much within the constraints of, within the ambit rather, and powers of what ought to be at a local government level. The US is a really good example of this with school district sites, which are these heavily contested parts of what makes for the local government. And there are challenges, there are questions of equity, regional inequality, which in very federal structures we have, but there are ways of dealing with that without undermining the fundamental principles of federalism.
But the US system's the opposite of portable, right? You're kind of trapped within your own school district unless you can physically move your location and buy a house somewhere else and
Yes,
things like
yeah,
that.
yeah. That's how you enter into the system.
Yeah, so why doesn't the PDS kind of portability, how would we design that for local schools? Let's stick with government schools for now. Let's not say just get a voucher and go to a private school. Because I know the passion project is to improve government schools. So I don't want to shift your goalpost and say you should have a different goal. But even within that goal, given that India has scale, why not say that these are 5 villages where your school voucher is portable between any of these 5 villages and go to the school that you wish to go to?
I don't necessarily have any response to that apart from saying that that requires degrees of decentralization that we simply don't have in the system.
Yeah.
I mean, in some senses, the logic for why the school had to come to the village was defined in a context tracing back to now 30-35 years, where mobility was a challenge and portability was not something that we thought of as much. And so we always assume that if the school is closest to where the student is, the ease with which the student can actually access a school is strengthened. Of course, there has been a lot of kind of change in local context now. Infrastructure has improved, accessibility has improved. The cycle scheme was, in fact, a very good example of precisely a version of that portability, that
Yeah.
school बच्चे के पास नहीं है, तो why not give them mobility so that they can go to the school? That was exactly the thinking behind that. So I think these are experiments that can be achieved within a framework that recognizes that what can be done best at that level of government must and should be done best. So the principle of subsidiarity that needs to be baked in to the system. But there's one other last kind of point I want to make, which is quite central to both the portability question and more broadly how we've always thought about welfare, which is that so there's been some part of universalization of welfare now around a certain set of benefits, pensions, maternity benefits, etc. But largely, we have rarely thought, we haven't built the welfare state as deeply intertwined into an enabler of the structural transformation. And increasingly, in fact, we are, because in our early days, we made this kind of separation between formal and informal, where to the extent that there were labor protections baked in, it was largely in the formal sector, and that kind of we took it to an extreme that was unhelpful for both. And then we ignored the informal, and which was largely in the rural, and only built this up post liberalization. But again, it was built around a context of precocity and and a set of a flaw of universalization of certain sets of benefits, and their resource constraints were always used as an excuse to ensure that this was limited and targeted. And it was a big fight to even get us to start thinking about these as universal benefits. I think now with cash transfers, we are moving in that direction a little bit. But again, as we have moved towards cash transfers, welfare has become very much a compensation for an economy, to draw on Ratin Roy's famous way of kind of putting it as a compensation for a state that is simply not able to be a genuine developmental state and create economic opportunity for all. So we're not kind of thinking about welfare in that way, which is one of the reasons why education and health often
Yeah.
get set aside too.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the challenge, a genuinely 21st century welfare state that supports all Indians and is in all ways universal, is a state that where welfare is kind of integrated into the structural transformation of the economy such that it actually generates economic opportunity and shared prosperity for all. And that's where we are lacking. So we just don't have the imagination for that. And increasingly, we're just kind of treating this, along with this digitization, as not much else than a new cash transfer of 2,000 rupees and 3,000 rupees, all of which are really pittance in the larger scheme of things. You're addressing basic distress. You're not dealing with the larger challenges that need to be addressed.
That's a little bit depressing, but still a great note to end on. And thank you for the book. The book is really, I mean, it's surprised. I've read you for so long, Yamini, but it still surprised me in the following sense that we know that building state capacity is a huge thing and it's not easy and it's taken 100 years in many other places and things like that. But I think you really open the hood and show us the mechanics of how state capacity and capability can be built, how bureaucrats can learn, how we can all learn. And so that's pretty interesting. Now, how far we go with this is a separate matter, but it's very useful and it's so refreshing to read this compared to the RCTs and I don't know, people scraping big data on Python and doing some measurement exercise, which is pointless. So this is just super refreshing and very well written. Thank you so much for the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shruti. I'm so delighted to hear you say that. You made my week, my month, my year. So really appreciate it. As always, it's such fun talking to you. Your questions open up such a wide range of areas of thinking, and you kind of push one to pull it all together to try and tell a comprehensive story. Really appreciate and really enjoyed this chat. So thank you.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.